because of cocaine and narco trafficking, when the peace process created all these incredible possibilities, for example, in the area of rural projects. And when you tell them, look, we are going to pay for this and we are going to teach you this and that with the support of these like-minded countries, we're going to support this specific project and it's going to be great and we're going to invest in this agro-industry project. When you tell them at the end of the day that you are going to need to work, you are going to need to spend, sweat and blood in pushing this project forward, some of them, normally less than 20%, they say, oh my God, it's easier just to be a narco.
Welcome back to The Focus. My name is Neil Smart. I'm one of the producers of the program. John is temporarily indisposed with the flu, but fortunately we have the second part of John's conversation with General Alberto José Mejía Ferrero, the former commander of the Colombian Armed Forces. We continue their discussion on counterinsurgency, Colombia's defeat of the FARC, and the strategic lessons that can be drawn from decades of conflict. We pick up the interview with John asking General Mejía about Colombia's enduring urban-rural divide and how that divide shaped the country's development, its internal conflict, and the conditions in which the FARC was able to operate. Let's turn to the conversation.
It's really interesting hearing you say this. I mean, I know that Colombia is on a more extreme position from what I will retell here, but there does seem in most countries to have an urban city divide, or in any federation there's the national capital and then there are the other outlying territories, and there's always some sort of tension between those two groups. Here in Australia, we've got Canberra, and Canberra and the state governments throughout Australia have a relatively tense sort of relationship. Sometimes they get on because the political party in Canberra is the political party in a particular state or territory, and that's fine. But there's always that sort of localized, peripheral, or even rural setting versus the capital and its prerogative. Do you see that Bogota has now developed into its own bubble, and trying to break this bubble, like the way that you say the new president hopes to do, will be a good way of moving forward and developing Colombia for the future? Because again, if you can't bring all of the people around Colombia in what you would consider ungoverned spaces into a governance structure, you have problems, and you will always have problems.
John, in the 19th century, in the early days of our republic, we had wars in Colombia just between federalist and centralist. Right. So we went to war for that, and we killed each other because of that.
Yeah.
So the federal approach, in my opinion, is really, it could actually change the scenario drastically. But of course, in order for Colombia to change that, I will predict that it's difficult, and we'll have to change our constitution, and it's a huge political change. But something that is now, for the first time, pushing and going into that direction is two things. One is what happened during this last government. For the past 4 years, for the first time in our history, we had the worst possible government ever, under a president that was a communist, a leftist, a member of the M19 guerrillas, so he was a terrorist. And because of a peace process, he became a regular citizen. And he won the presidency of Colombia after the peace agreements with FARC and all of that. But this guy, he actually acted against those cities, mayors, and those governors in the most important states of Colombia that were against his political posture and his political opinions. So he stopped sending the resources, he stopped pushing projects forward, etc. So he left Colombians alone in most of these places. For example, he fought the 5 most important cities of Colombia. He fought Bogota, Medellin, Cali, Barranquilla, and Bucaramanga. The mayors of these cities were more into the other side of the political spectrum, and he stopped supporting health, supporting education, supporting infrastructure, etc. So it's crazy that a president that represents the whole state of Colombia can do that just because of his political inability to accept the reality there. But right now, our Congress approved a law that, in my opinion, is going to change this drastically, because they now are ordering for the first time that a very important portion of the state resources, like 35%, is going to go directly into the states of Colombia, into the different departments of Colombia. So the projects, the investments, the infrastructure, what they really need for the realities is not going to be decided in a desk in Bogota with this centralized vision and with this very, in my opinion, very disconnected approach towards those communities. So now they are going to be able to do that, to decide that. Of course, I imagine that at the beginning, sadly, there's going to be corruption around that. But right now, we are going to need, with this new government, we are going to need to develop the local and regional capabilities so they can invest these resources under, the necessary standards. Because as you know, all these projects, they need to have some specific parts and components and standards, etc. And in many places they don't know how to do this, so they are going to need the support from the central government. But the idea of just spreading resources and letting them vote, letting them take their decisions where to build the bridge, where to really invest on this highway or the other, where to invest in this hospital or the other, etc. In my opinion, is going to be a game changer for Colombia. But we are going to test this new possibility, John.
So basically, it's really it's not even a conflict anymore, but it is a tussle of ideas between a Bogota national consciousness versus a Colombia national consciousness. And I think you're right. I think that by putting it all together in that sort of decentralized fashion, you'll get more traction in developing more of a Colombia-centric vision of what the country ought to be. So look, I keep my fingers crossed, Alberto. I think it's vitally important for the future of your country to go down this particular path. Because as I see, even in little old Britain, in England, the new Prime Minister, Andy Burnham, had made this big notion. I don't know how it's going to work because Britain is a completely different sort of country from Colombia or Australia. But, he said that he's going to have an office of number 10 in his city of Manchester, as opposed to keeping power centralized, or the prime ministerial power centralized in London, as it has always been. Now, whether it works in the British sense, we don't know. We'll wait and see. But I do
Yeah.
think now that there is this. Yeah, look, I've even been caught up in discussions here where Canberra's over centralizing views of things have been a net deficit for Australia. We have people talking about Aboriginal affairs who have never stepped in Aboriginal territory, not once in their entire career. And yet somehow they know how it is, how life is like to struggle out in the desert of northwest Western Australia, for instance, you know. And of course they don't. They have maybe an idealized version of some documentary they saw on the national broadcaster, 20 years ago, which does not track with reality. And so, of course, it's really important for not just politicians, but for bureaucrats to get out from behind the national desk and to go traveling to see how their policy is being implemented throughout the country to figure out whether or not it works. So yes, look, fingers crossed, Alberto. Really. Look, let's continue on with looking at a couple of things that have been happening within Colombia, and especially with regard to FARC. I mean, when FARC was issued its defeat and there was the ceasefire, do you believe that FARC were ultimately defeated militarily, politically, or psychologically?
Let me tell you, you know, of course, we developed different campaign plans, a succession of campaign plans, in order to disrupt and diminish the whole FARC structure. For many years, we were mainly dedicated to fight what we call the military subsystem of FARC. So that is when you are tempted to use body count. That is when you are tempted to just go after their different units, guerrillas and companies and fronts and blocks, etc., etc. But we really started to change our approach in how to tackle the FARC when we decided to see the FARC as a biological body that has subsystems, like the human body, the nervous system, respiratory system, digestive system, etc. So it was very special. I was honored to lead this group that created this campaign plan. When I was a student at the U.S. Army War College, I did my master's degree thesis about seeing the FARC with different subsystems. So when I was ordered by the president to create this plan to force the FARC to negotiate, the first order of business that we asked the president was, Mr. President, please let us have access to every single computer, USB, and electronic device of FARC that we have actually confiscated and is in the hands of the judicial authorities and is not part of our intelligence vision. Every time we seize something because of this first response protection policy, we need to protect the information, and we give it immediately to the judicial authorities. So we lost immediately that intelligence and the possibility to understand the enemy. So they gave us that. The first portion of information that I received were 7.3 terabytes of FARC information, with all the emails, all the doctrine, all the orders, all the confirmation of fronts, everything, and every single piece of that was made and written and produced by FARC. It was not a creation of the military. It was not a creation of our imagination. So we actually established 3,700 variables of FARC, and we put some mathematical weight to the different variables, and they went into 6 FARC subsystems. So after this study, FARC became an organization that for the first time we started to see it with a military subsystem. We call it armed subsystem. We don't like to use them to call them military. A political and diplomatic subsystem, a territorial subsystem because they control territories and they exercise governance in some criminal governance in some of these places. And they use laws and regulations of Colombia in order to insert their hidden organizations in order to control geography. Of course, resources, everything related to their financial and economic activities, support networks, and the 6th subsystem that actually was like transversal to the other 5 was their command and control structure. So all these indicators went into these 6 families, and for the first time we started to see the perfect iceberg, things that we saw and believed, but many others that were below the iceberg and we never saw. For example, the FARC, in their political and diplomatic subsystem, they have, for example, the International Front of FARC. So the sons and daughters of FARC leadership were living and in the top universities of Sweden, Finland, Norway, Switzerland, Mexico, Paraguay, and many other places. And we didn't know that, and we did not have our foreign affairs system. They didn't know that. Our ambassadors and military attaches and political attaches, they were in these areas and they didn't know anything about it. And these people, they were using non-kinetic approaches, fighting against Colombian policies and fighting every action that we were trying to do in Europe and in many places around the world. So the idea was like, so how are we going to go after them? Of course, we need to use a non-kinetic approach. We started to actually understand their organization, their composition, their locations, etc. And we created an incredible strategy with the support of governments, of national polices around the world, and also working with Interpol, Europol, Ameripol, and many other partners. And for the first time, we started to capture these people overseas, and the people that we captured were the sons and daughters of the top FARC commanders in the fields of Colombia, the old guys, the toughest guys. When they started to see their sons and daughters being captured by the police overseas, of course, that specific action produced an effect in their leadership, in their decision-making processes, etc. Let me give you another example. For example, in the area of command and control, because of FARC information, we were able to understand, and we didn't know that before, we were able to understand which top commanders of FARC, especially front and block and company commanders, had AIDS. You know, this very terrible illness, AIDS. So like the idea was that, what are we going to do with this? So we created this very sophisticated information campaign and psychological operations in order to let their own people in their own fronts, to let them know that this was happening. And in many cases, because they were infecting young girls and young boys within the ranks. In some cases, they were actually they went into what they call like their own war tribunals inside the FARC, and they were sentenced to death by their own organization. So
Right.
this idea, John, of understanding these 6 subsystems, in my opinion, was like the cornerstone that helped us to continue to produce a steady degradation of FARC capabilities. And every year for the following decade, before they turn into the peace process, we actually study the campaign plan, understand what they have changed or learned, adopted and took as our own, the lessons observed and learned in the fields in how to fight these different subsystems, and create the necessary innovations in order to change every year our plans and to have a steady progress over these very rich organizations. And when they started the peace process, they went from 25,000 under the democratic security policy of President Alberto Uribe. We were able to diminish them to the around the 15,000, and then with these plans we were able to push them down to a number in which they decided to negotiate a number around 7,000 people in arms. So steady progress and a common strategy, but especially all the armed forces and our national police working together under one single leadership, with something that to me is a key factor, monthly indicators and monthly evaluation of progress in all areas. Because sometimes, you order to create, for example, this Intel Fusion Center in the middle of this very complex area in the border with Venezuela. And if you just give the order, perhaps things are going to take longer and they're going to wait for the budget. And in 6 months, nothing has happened. But with this process of just being on top and evaluating every single part of the process, it really helped to change the situation. And it forced FARC to strategically decide to negotiate. And to tell you the truth, of course, we at the very beginning, we did not believe that this actually negotiation was going to get to an end. But at the end, incredible things happened. They decided to comply with the peace process. They accepted that the army of Colombia, the winners, were going to protect them in their concentration sites. They decided that they were going to turn the weapons into the UN delegates. They decided they were going to take their uniforms off. They decided that they were going to respect the Colombian constitutions and laws. And they decided that they were going to comply with the state laws. And that is when we finally, we knew that we won. Sadly, because of cocaine and narco trafficking, when the peace process created all these incredible possibilities, for example, in the area of rural projects, and when you tell them, look, we are going to pay for this and we are going to teach you this and that with the support of these like-minded countries, we are going to support this specific project and it's going to be great and we're going to invest in this agro-industry project. When you tell them at the end of the day that you are going to need to work, you are going to need to spend, sweat and blood in pushing this project forward, some of them, normally less than 20%, they say, oh my God, it's easier just to be a narco. It's easier to be a narco terrorist. With cocaine, I don't have to work. With cocaine, I only need to carry an AK-47. I just need to be a regular bandit, threatening people, threatening the peasants, and just living by that and getting more resources and more than what the government is offering. The government is offering minimum wage. I can make that number 10 times just by being a part of the cocaine business. Also, that is the sad cancer of Colombia, dear John.
Wow. Okay. So, Alberto, I have to ask the question, what role does the National Liberation Army, or the ELN, now play in Colombia's security environment?
Yeah, the ELN, National Liberation Army, is an old organization, as old as FARC. They have been more than 60 years around in the country, with very strong connections in their history with Cuba. And as we went after the FARC, which was the largest and strongest and most difficult guerrilla group of Colombia, they actually decided they took a very special approach, and most of their fronts and most of their leadership, they went into Venezuela. So in a way, in a sense, they became a binational terrorist organization, a binational guerrilla. So today we have in Venezuela 60% of ELN's structures and command and control. So, for example, one of the top leaders of the ELN, the most terrible guy, is called Pablito, alias Pablito. And Pablito lives in Venezuela. For decades, they have been protected by the Chavista revolution and by Maduro. And I really hope, John, that now that the U.S. is involved in Venezuela, and that there are some stages in which they are going to get rid, I hope sooner than later, of this regime and reestablish democracy there, etc. I really hope that we could change the security situation in the border between Colombia and Venezuela, close to 2,000 kilometers, and actually do like trilateral operations with the U.S., Venezuelan forces, and Colombian forces in order to tackle the ELN that is located in Venezuela, and actually in order to reduce their ability to harm the Colombian territories. So very much involved in narco trafficking. And today, a bit finally is that this ELN, they went not only into Venezuela, into narco trafficking. They have created FARC dissidences at ELN. They created in Venezuela groups of like multinational organized crime companies. So from there, they collect cocaine, but also illegal gold, and they connect to these international networks, this big umbrella of transnational organized crime, and they move cocaine and gold and rare minerals around the place. And of course, they had the ability to make more money. And of course, these resources help them to regenerate their own forces and their ability to harm Colombia. So still a complicated group to fight, and especially because a very important part of that group is in Venezuela. Of course, it's difficult for Colombia to do something, across the border.
Well, this actually raises another interesting aspect, and that is Latin American security cooperation. Do Latin American militaries cooperate enough, or do historical rivalries still prevent the region from developing a genuine collective security environment?
Yeah, in my opinion, very, very little cooperation. As a matter of fact, the idea of President Trump of creating this so-called the shield of the Americas.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is to be able to push these processes of coordination and cooperation forward.
Yeah.
Here, the region in general, we have been fighting within every single country between left and right, left and right, left and right. So normally this happen in isolation. So it's impossible to coordinate that all countries will go to one side or the other. So to give you an example, when Ecuador was in the left, Colombia was in the right. So cooperation was zero. Now we have Colombia on the left. We still one more to go, sadly, and Ecuador on the right. So cooperation is zero. So when you have these political clashes and when you have this political friction between posture and positions, the only people winning are the bad guys. The only people winning is the so-called transnational organized crime. But to tell you the truth, in my opinion, today, if you ask me, and I'm going to be a little bit aggressive with this, what I'm trying to say. States of Latin America, they don't have the ability, they don't have the infrastructure, they don't have what it needs or what it takes to understand the impact of transnational organized crime.
Right.
Illegal mining is now going from Brazil to Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, and then laundering money, for example, in Nicaragua, and then gold is being sent to Dubai, just to give an example, and things like that. But every country tends to be very parochial. They only see their own problems in their way, and they believe that coordination is a way in which you cede your sovereignty. And that is, in my opinion, the wrong way to go. We need coordination, articulation, and state policies. Let's take off, if we can, I don't know how to do it. Let's take off ideologies. Let's take off political postures, and we all want to protect the Amazonian region. Let's work together and create the necessary mechanisms for coordination, cooperation, and especially to be able to exchange real-time information, intelligence, and actually, in many cases, to operate together and to share many things. We have tried to do that in some occasions with incredible results. Let me give you an example. With Panama, when I was the Army commander, we created binational military bases in the border between Panama and Colombia. Right. So it was like a circle in the middle of the jungle, thick Darien jungle, and half of the base on Panamanian territory was with Panamanian security forces, and half of the base in Colombian territory was with Colombian soldiers, and we were patrolling together. We support them with medevac operations when they have some soldiers sick or ill or bitten by snake, etc., etc. It proves to be very successful, and I'm talking just of a tactical instrument of binational cooperation.
Yeah. Well, on that, and you mentioned the Latin American shield that the Trump administration is thinking of setting up. You know, Donald Trump is a very divisive figure. There are many people who look at all the initiatives that he's putting forward, including those of a military nature, to be not optimal. Although it would be nice to know that at least one of the things that have come out of the Trump 47 camp will be successful in terms of bringing together Latin American states for a sense of developing a sense of collective security of that Western Hemispheric region. How do you see what Donald Trump has put forward? Are there mechanisms by which this Latin American shield is moving ahead, or is it just, like many things that come out of Washington these days, a lot of hot air, a lot of promises, but no substance to those promises? How do you see that? And please be as bold as you will, because I'm desperately looking for a good outcome here.
Yeah, John, look, uh, of course, I fully support any kind of strategic cooperation with the US. Plan Colombia proof that actually save Colombia's democracy. Of
Yeah,
that incredible importance was Plan Colombia. So I don't know the different mechanisms or policies that this shield of the Americas is going to push forward. But what I see right now is of course this rivalry between the two parties in the US is against this cooperation and against this long-term vision. We don't want, I don't want to see the Shield of America just as a Trump administration initiative, but
yeah,
as a US state initiative for a long-term positioning in the region. But most important than that, during the last decades, the US, every time they have tried to bring some policies of cooperation into the region, these approaches and these well-intended approaches, they're always left behind by very difficult global priorities.
yeah,
So when Afghanistan, Iraq, the global war on terror, Syria, whatever, China, Russia, Ukraine, etc. All these very difficult complexities, they normally push down the priority that Latin America should be or should have. And that is, in my opinion, what China has understood. China has been, very, very slowly seeing that and seeing the approach in the region and seeing the US going afar from the region and just being involved in the war against drugs, and that's it. But, not highly involved in social development, in economics and things like that. So they jump into the region and they start offering these projects and these exchanges, etc. And as a result of that, China has become the number one commercial partner of 98% of the countries in the region. The only two countries that perhaps are not there are Colombia and Mexico. So the idea of having more cooperation and more presence, etc., is really, really very, very important. And we need the US not only to be present with this security approach against international organized crime and of course, narco trafficking, and that, of course, it is very important, but countries need to develop, presidents and governments, they need to offer, a change to their people, and the idea of building infrastructure and having these networks and this connection and this connectivity for education and things like that is really very, very important, and that's what China is doing in the region. You don't see that from Russia.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, Alberto, I'm just wondering about the whole Western Hemispheric defense idea that has been pushed by Trump 47. You know, many American administrations, you know, including Democratic ones, have their particular strategic priority areas. You know, the Obama administration famously wanted to pivot toward Asia, but simply couldn't unpivot from the Middle East because the Middle East is like the mafia. You want to get out, but they keep on pulling you back in. And I mean, the Trump administration are now victims of that same methodology, you know, over Iran. They want to get out, but they can't leave. And I think the nature of Israel itself will make it impossible for the Americans to leave easily the Middle East, not unless there's a general peace in that area, which I can't see happen anytime soon. So, how optimistic are you that the US State Department, that the Pentagon really are behind the notion of Western Hemispheric defense when clearly their forces are scattered all over the place? Clearly, Iran has meant that they burnt off a lot of key strategic assets, which has now changed the strategic equilibrium of the United States globally. And again, as you rightly point out, Alberto, the American government will change its order of priorities because it has to, being the country that it is, and especially now that it's become even more transactional than before. So how do you square anything with that? You know, I mean, Colombia has had a very unique and very long-standing and close relationship with the United States.
Yeah.
Is that still the case?
Yeah. Look, what I see now is, in general, the whole hemisphere, the political pendulum is moving to the right. The only countries that are still on the other side, democratic countries, are Mexico and Brazil. Colombia was part of that group, but now is going back to the right. And we still have two very strong communist countries in the region, Cuba and Nicaragua, countries that they always try to create problems and to push revolutions and to push social revolt and to support these terrorist activities, etc., etc. So the good news, in my opinion, is for the U.S. to have a presence and to have a say in the region. They really don't need many troops. And Southcom, which is the joint command in charge for this theater, is an organization that has the necessary troops and resources to actually to make things happen. What we need, of course, is the support of economic resources, the support of stronger intelligence capabilities, the support of more technical capacity, for example, in the area of criminal investigation, and of course, to be able to have the necessary technologies, because right now, transnational organized crime and illegal groups like ELN and FARC, all these criminal organizations, FARC Disidencias and Clan del Golfo, are now pushing states, in this case Colombia, into the corner using, for example, drones, using sophisticated technology. For example, you have illegal mining sites in which, for example, illegal money is being used in a cell phone, in a wallet, and they are making investments from the middle of the jungle in bitcoins. So
Amazing.
states, they don't have they don't know how to fight against this complexity. So you don't need a B-52 to fight against transnational organized crime. You don't need an F-22 to fight against these kinds of threats that are very rich, and they could be very, very bad for your people, and they can be, incredible assassins, and they can really treat your populations in a way that you cannot believe. For example, let me tell you, in Catatumbo, in the border with Venezuela, we have populations kidnapped collectively by the ELN, so they cannot move. Nobody can get in this little 2,000 people population, to give an example. And they are contained and surrounded by enemy drones. So drones are terrorizing small populations in the middle of nowhere. And of course, our military is far behind the possibility to create a comprehensive strategy against all of these. And now we are investing like crazy millions of dollars in drones without really even having, what is going to be our operational concept if they are using, cheapest drones in the market.
So that's one of the, sorry, Alberto, that is an international problem that we're starting to see all over the place. I mean, we just look at Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine in many ways has democratized the new way of warfare. But how do you see that the cartels and the narco traffickers have seen what's going on there, and they buy the commercial quadcopters that used to photograph weddings are now dropping explosives all over the place? I mean, there's an adaptability that they can use this sort of technology. And of course, it's not just that technology, there's also encryption. They're using all these sophisticated AI-derived systems now. So from the drones to the encryption to all these other electronic devices that have spun out of the various wars around the world, and they're now being embedded within the drug cartel paramilitaries. Are they actually adapting faster to new technology than the nation state?
Oh, yes, very, very smart. They know what is going on there. They understand that is very important for their own survivability and adaptability. And look, for decades, they have been using Russian engineers to build their own semi-submersibles, like small ships that carry 7, 8, 10 tons of cocaine. They don't go completely under the sea, but they go a little bit below the water. We call it semi-submersibles. And so we never had the ability to actually study, holistically, okay, where are they hiring these people? Why Russian? Where this is happening? When are they coming into the country? What is happening when they're doing when they arrive to our different ports and entry ports, etc. We just see the problem when we seize or destroy the semi-submersible, but not before that. So, John, I'm very, very worried right now with all the Colombian retired professional soldiers that are today fighting or on the Ukrainian side, or the numbers are large, could be around the 10,000.
Wow. Yeah,
but because of their ability to fight, they have been hired by this government to be part of that conflict.
Yep.
So I'm worried about that. Not all of them are working in the area of drones and technology, but some of them. And they are there just because they get paid to do that, and because with those resources they can sustain their families back in Colombia. Many of them have been killed because of their participation in those conflicts. But what happened when experts in using these technologies are back into Colombia and they are being reached by FARC, ELN, or Clan del Golfo, and they offer to them, a very generous pay to be able to work for them and do bad things. That could really happen. So we are worried about it. Of course, they learn by YouTube. They are always scanning conflicts around the world, and they learn in how to harm conventional military forces and how to harm police units, etc., etc. But right now, for the first time, we are seeing, highly undeveloped areas of Colombia, like in Cauca, a place called El Plateado, with guerrillas that operate in 20th century mode, in the way they move, they survive, they eat, and they sleep, etc., etc. But those guerrillas, they have access to the smallest Chinese drones that they can actually buy by Amazon or in the market, and they learn how to put explosives in those drones. And now these very unsophisticated guerrillas, they send a reconnaissance drone against a patrol or a convoy or a police station, and then a group of drones, 6, 8, 7 drones, going after this unit with explosives and attacking the units. And our ability to react to that has been slow and difficult, and as always, states tend to be late against these threats that are always trying to innovate and to harm the state, in this case, the state of Colombia.
Alberto, you've been extremely generous to us. We're getting up to the 2-hour mark here, so I realize that the clock is running. But I've got a bunch of other questions to ask you. Maybe we can save that for another time, but I've got 3 final questions that I think are vital to this particular discussion. Would you be able to stay with us for those 3 questions?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Of course.
Fantastic. Thank you. Okay, question number 1. If you were the Colombian Armed Forces chief yet again, and it was up to you to counter the very threat that you've just said, what would be your 3 priority areas for the Colombian Armed Forces to go down in terms of defense acquisitions and capabilities, as well as just strategy? I mean, how would you employ them? You're right. I mean, people look at drones and they're buying drones left, right, and center, but there's no sense of what they're going to be doing with them once they've got them embedded within the armed forces. There's no broader strategic idea. It's just that I've got a drone now. Okay, so what do you do?
Yeah, the case of Colombia is very, very specific, and my answer depends on politics.
Yep.
Because this President Petro, that I told you was a member of the M19 guerrillas, he was a terrorist. One of his policies was to really diminish the capabilities of the armed forces, to reduce their budgets financially, and to weaken our different subsystems.
Yeah.
So and one of the ways he did that was by breaking relationships with our 2 main partners in the area of security, with Israel, and in a sense, with the US. So they stopped buying all these repair parts. For example, all our radios are from Israel and the US. They stopped buying radios, they stopped buying repair parts. So now we are suffering the consequences. Our rifles are from Israel. They stop buying the spare parts, etc. So, for example, 40% of Colombian Army's rifles are in trouble today. So my first order of business is initially to reconstitute and reset our capabilities. And of course, we cannot fight all over the place. So we need to understand in which places we have the ability to contain and in which other places we have the ability to actually really exercise the meaning of a main effort, to go there with the energy and all the forces. And of course, in my opinion, I would love to push. I don't see like the approach of a Plan Colombia 2.0 coming to life, but plans in which, as we did in the past, when we trained military and police forces in Central America, Caribbean region, and in South America, we did this alliance between the host country, Colombia, training because of our Spanish ability, because what we have learned during this war, and the U.S. paying for all of this. So, like a trilateral, a combined approach, for example, against narco trafficking and illegal mining between Colombia, Ecuador, with the support of the U.S., and the same thing in Venezuela. With those approaches, we actually will send the message to these people that they don't have safe havens anymore. They don't have a place to hide, and we are going to force them to move. We started to win the war against the FARC of Colombia when, for the first time, FARC top leadership that used to be in these very old camps, having the greatest life and having parties and drinking scotch and all of that, when they were forced to walk every day and to sleep in the middle of nowhere in a different place every night because they have bombing missions and they have the helicopters, blading around their locations. When they saw that, they went from being very fat into being very skinny, very weak, seeing their sons and daughter captured in Europe and being bombed all over the place, and special forces spread all over the place. We constitute and reset the armed forces for the fight. Yep. Then to establish very, very important priorities, because we don't have the resources to be all over the place. So we need to understand where we can contain and where we can actually really change the situation in the ground. I told you to work very closely with the government of Ecuador and Venezuela under the U.S. umbrella in order to really be able to go after transnational organized crime in the border. And perhaps finally, to really to help the state of Colombia to develop the ability to bring the state to those places that we have prioritized, establishing the different theater of operations priorities by really being able to regulate in which places we can contain and in which places we can exercise the priority for operations, like to bring the main effort. We cannot have 10 main efforts. So we need to have a very few with all the resources and with all the helicopters and with all the capabilities. The other thing is to help the Colombian state to be able to bring, for the first time, a very strong and permanent unified action approach in order to force the state into the reality of Colombia. And finally, as I mentioned, to me, the importance to be able to work trilaterally with Ecuador and then in Venezuela under the umbrella of the US in order to tackle transnational organized crime, narco trafficking, and illegal mining by working together and making combined operations, having these fusion intelligence centers, and really, sharing real-time information in order to stop what they are doing in the borders and in order to stop this sense of insecurity that they bring into the borders between Colombia and Venezuela and Colombia and Ecuador.
Okay, so last two questions, Alberto. I think they're really important just to cap everything. The first one that comes to mind is, for all intents and purposes, the war against the FARC was a successful counterinsurgency operation that was prosecuted by the Colombian Armed Forces, and it was supported by the United States in a very real fashion. But yet, the United States doesn't have great reputation for being able to fight counterinsurgency wars. It lost Iraq. It's lost and was humiliated out of Afghanistan. So my question to you is, why was Colombia successful when clearly the Americans did not know what they were doing while they were in Iraq? I mean, they had some good ideas, but they weren't followed up, and there were their own sort of political issues, both on the ground in Iraq as well as in Washington, D.C. at the time, that may have prevented a successful outcome in that country. And the same could be said for Afghanistan. So why was Colombia successful?
Look, a very tricky question, John, because if you ask most of Colombia, the people that today live in the rurality of Colombia, under the pressure of ELN, Clan del Golfo, and FARC dissidencies, they will tell you that we have never won. They will tell you that we haven't been able to change the security situation, and they will tell you that this just has been the most prolonged nightmare for them and their families. So yes, the peace process against FARC was successful, but of course, implementation, very difficult. And of course, when you have FARC dissidencies wearing the same badge and the same name of FARC, then you have the rest of the country saying, oh, so now we have some FARC that have become like regular citizens and we are investing on them, and now they have a political party, but at the same time you have an illegal FARC that is still, doing narco trafficking and kidnapping and extortion and killing people and attacking military and police units, etc., etc. So very, very difficult. And to tell you the truth, I don't want to say that we have won. To date, when we have the largest size of criminal economies in our history, with more than 300,000 hectares of coca, and with the largest numbers of illegal mining, with extortion and micro-extortion all over the place, with kidnapping, again, rising, with contraband in the borders between Colombia and Venezuela and Colombia and Ecuador growing, etc., and transnational organized, invisibly present all over the country. I cannot tell you that we have won. I cannot tell you that we have been close to win. On the contrary, right now, the president that just won the presidency of Colombia, he ran under the idea of rescuing Colombia back again.
Right.
So very, very difficult. And this has happened in Colombia, especially because of our geopolitical location, and especially for your audience to understand that we have, very, very drastically different geographical regions in Colombia, 6 of them. We have deserts in some areas of Colombia, but thick jungles, 2 oceans, high mountains. We do operations, infantry operations, in some places of around 4,500 meters altitude.
Yeah.
You walk 1 kilometer up there, you could die
Yeah.
because of the lack of oxygen. So very, very complex geography. For example, to do a medevac up there at that altitude, the winds many times have, flipped the helicopters and produce, terrible accidents because of the strength of those winds up there. And very cold locations, and in some other places, very hot locations with tropical illnesses such as malaria and leishmaniasis, among many others. So a very difficult war. But if you ask me, now that this president is going to try to recover the security of Colombia, very important international partners and alliances.
Yeah.
Of course, you need to have the mobility because this is a war of helicopters.
Mm-hmm.
You need to have close air support. And you must have, and this was a recommendation that a very, very close friend, an American hero, Ralph Puckett, who won the Medal of Honor, 7 Purple Hearts. He was the honorary commandant of the 75th Ranger Regiment. I'm myself, I'm a U.S. Army Ranger of Class 1086. He told me, I asked him, how could we win this war against this very savvy enemy that moves in the fields of Colombia with incredible speed and ability? And he told me, you need to do every single task of the light infantry fight 10 times better than your enemy. So we need to have, better ability to fire, better ability not to produce noise and to make, smells. We need to have the strongest physical fitness ever. We need to be able to own the jungles, own high mountain operations to really, be on top of all of this to be able to be better than the enemy. And to tell you the truth, we also need to have our civilian masters involved in leading the strategy, involved in exercising civilian control over the military. And more important than all of that, we really need to maintain the highest standards in the application of human rights and international humanitarian law, but also in everything that is related to the military and our national police democratic values. We cannot lose sight of those values, because when you lose that is when you go into the dark side of war and conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, final question, Alberto. How has absorbing millions of Venezuelans changed Colombia economically, socially, and even from a national security perspective?
The impact of having more than 3 million Venezuelans in Colombia has been very, very big. To tell you the truth, the government of Colombia has been one of the few governments that decided actually to receive these people with positive policies.
Yeah.
And actually we gave them the possibility to have access into our health and education and other policies. So today, every single Venezuelan child in Colombia is going to school. Every single Venezuelan child in Colombia is having vaccination. When they arrive into Colombia, they were decades behind in vaccination, just to give you an example. So we are really very, very proud. At the very beginning, there were very bad abuses in some areas, especially in the borders and in some areas far away from the urban centers, in which people used to hire them to do agriculture or to take care of cattle or whatever, and they used to pay them just a very little portion of the law mandate for any worker in Colombia. Now all of that is in a more stable way. Of course, there is also a very dark side of this, in which you can find prostitution, illegal migration, abuses of minors, and things like that. That is very sad. But in general, Colombia has been very good, and especially the idea behind all of this is based on the knowledge that, many years ago, when Venezuela was under the oil boom and they were very, very rich, millions of Colombia went there to live and work and raise their families. So this was like an opportunity to help and to actually to show this very strong humanitarian approach from our government. In my opinion, very, very successful. And to tell you the truth, most of the 3 million Venezuelans living now in Colombia, all of them, they keep, because of what they get in Colombia legally and because of the hard work they do in Colombia, they support their families and they help them to survive in those very difficult conditions. Now, after these very terrible 2 earthquakes, the situation, as you can imagine, is even worse. So we are really worried about it because the burden of having 3 million people in our own system has been very harsh. And in many cases, you have Colombians asking, okay, what happened with my own health? What happened with the education of my own kids? Why are you giving these resources to them? Why are you giving access to a house to these people, etc.? So nothing has been easy, but we are really very proud of what we did, and in my opinion, history will judge that approach, especially made by President Iván Duque, is going to judge him, and very, heart-loving with those Venezuelans in need.
General Alberto José Mejía Ferrero, thank you very much for joining us today on The Focus. It's been a privilege to hear your reflections on one of the most remarkable military and political transformations in the modern history of the Americas. Colombia's experience reminds us that defeating an insurgency is never simply about military power. It demands capable institutions, political resolve, effective intelligence, international partnerships, and above all, the confidence of the people. As we've discussed today, the threats are also evolving. Narco-trafficking, organized crime, cyber capabilities, drones, and artificial intelligence are reshaping the security landscape in ways that would have been almost unimaginable only a generation ago. The lessons from Colombia, therefore, extend well beyond Latin America. They speak to the future of democratic resilience and to the challenges governments around the world will increasingly face as technology empowers both state and non-state actors alike. Now on to questions for our audience. What is the single biggest lesson other democracies should learn from Colombia's decades-long campaign against insurgency and organized crime? As inexpensive technologies like drones and artificial intelligence become increasingly accessible, do you believe governments can stay ahead of criminal and insurgent organizations? Or will non-state actors continue to close the technological gap? Has the Western Hemisphere become a renewed strategic priority for the United States, or will Washington remain primarily focused on the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific over the coming decade? And to our viewers and listeners, thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed today's discussion, please like, subscribe, and share this episode. It does help us continue bringing leading strategic thinkers from around the world to the Focus. My thanks to producers of the Focus, Neil Smart and Lynn Sear. Until next time, I'm Dr. John Bruni. Thank you for watching.